This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. In Magic, protection is an evergreen keyword ability that's been around as long as the game has. A permanent or player always has protection from something, and that something is most frequently a color. While powerful, the ability isn't exactly intuitive. If a permanent or player has protection from something, that means the permanent can't be targeted, enchanted, blocked, or damaged by anything that has that quality. For example, White Knight can't be targeted by black spells, enchanted by black auras, blocked by black creatures, or damaged by any black source. The fact that a creature can't be blocked by creatures it has protection from, and can be destroyed by destroy all effects, is what trips players up sometimes. Basically, protection is simultaneously a form of evasion and a form of, well, protection. This is actually the second time I've done a top 10 on the subject, but the last time was in February of 2018, so it was time for an update. While technically evergreen, protection, especially from colors, is used a lot less these days than it used to be, but this list has still seen some significant change over the years. In this video, we'll look at the top 10 protection cards that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. Speaking of protection, let me tell you about today's special sponsor, Ridge, whose amazingly durable minimalist wallets not only look great, they also offer protection from RFID technology so that you can't be digitally pickpocketed. It's amazing they offer such great protection when they are so compact. I've had a Ridge wallet for about 3 years now, and I couldn't be happier that I made the switch. Despite the compact size, you can fit a whole lot of cards in them, and there's a money clip for cash too. You don't just have to take my word for it either. Ridge wallets have over 100,000 5-star reviews, and you can even go with a risk-free trial. You can try your Ridge wallet, and if you don't like it, you can send it back within 99 days and get a full refund. So if you want to pick up a great wallet while also supporting the channel, check out the description where you can see the wallet tagged. If you click on the link and then use the code YouTube10 at checkout, you'll get 10% off your purchase. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. So let's start with a look at the 5 cards from the 2018 list that didn't make it this time, starting with Master of Waves, which is at number 10 last time. For 3 generic and a blue, it's a 2-1 with protection from red, and it gives your elementals +1/+1, and that's important because when it enters, it creates a number of 1/0 blue elemental creature tokens equal to your devotion to blue. Your devotion being equal to the number of blue mana symbols and the casting cost of permanents you control. So even on its own, you end up getting a 2-1 merfolk and a 2-1 elemental. I always really appreciate the design of this card. The 1/0 thing is a little bit weird to be sure, but I think the fact that this can give you an insane elemental army in a mono blue deck, and it can do it super efficiently, is balanced out by the fact that if you deal with the master, all the elementals go away in most cases too. Furthermore, the use of protection here limits the amount of super cheap removal that can take down the master. Master of Waves helped make Devotion to Blue decks into one of the best decks in Standard, and it's gained several points in modern Merfolk decks as well, but even when I made the list back in 2018, it had been a year since it put up any top 8s, and it hasn't put up any since then either. This time around it took 79 points to make the list, so Master of Waves isn't even close. Next, there's Mirran Crusader, which was at number 9 last time. It's the first of many white cards in this video. While every color has access to protection, white gets it the most frequently as it suits their slice of the color pie the best. For 1 generic and 2 white, it's a 2/2 with double strike, protection from black, and protection from green. Having protection from 2 colors is pretty sweet, as lots of creatures with protection feel more like sideboard cards, but once you've expanded into 2 colors, you're talking about a creature with much more relevant protection. Double strike also means that this can get in for lots of damage in a hurry, and that was even more the case in the kinds of decks it was played in while it was in Standard, like Cobblade, a deck with lots of equipment to give the Crusader. It also gained points in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. In Modern, it still sees sideboard play today in equipment decks like Hammer Time, and in Legacy it shows up in the main deck of Death and Taxes, usually as a singleton copy that can be tutored up by Recruiter of the Guard. Basically, it's a nice aggressive creature that many decks have a hard time interacting with, and that's made it good even in non-rotating formats. It's been fairly active since 2018 too, but it didn't do quite enough to hold on to a spot on the list. Next there's Core Firewalker, which was at number 8 last time. For 2 white mana, it's a 2/2 with protection from red. Whenever a player casts a red spell, you can gain 1 life. The two cards we've looked at so far are cards that kind of have stuff going on apart from hating on a color, but not core Firewalker. It's all in on hating red, and it's the kind of design we used to see a lot when it came to protection. But even though there's only one thing that core Firewalker is good at, it's really good at it. Not only because red decks can't deal with it or block it, but because red decks hate it when their opponent gains life, and this throws that in for good measure. The all-in nature of the Firewalker has made it exclusively a sideboard card, but it's one that saw plenty of play in Standard, and it still sees occasional play in Modern today. Next, there's Etched Champion, which was at number 3 last time, so it took quite the tumble. For 3 generic, it's a 2/2, and when you control 3 or more artifacts, it has protection from all colors. So it takes some setup, but gaining protection from everything except colorless stuff is a pretty big deal. This card didn't see any play in Block or Standard, but for a long time it was right at home in Modern Affinity decks, where Metalcraft was pretty much a foregone conclusion. Additionally, those decks utilized things like Cranial Plating and Arcbound Ravager to make it so that this was huge, and that feels good because it of course can't be blocked by any colored creatures. The bad news for the champion is that the traditional Modern Affinity decks don't really exist anymore. These days they are super focused on going crazy with +1/+1 counters, on Arcbound Ravager and similar creatures, and the champion isn't nearly as good of a fit as it used to be. That's why it's only gained 5 points and hasn't gained any since 2022. It's very unlikely it ever ends up back on the list. And the last card from the 2018 list that didn't make it this time is Stormbreath Dragon, which was at number 2 last time. For 3 generic and 2 red, it's a 4/4 with flying, haste, and protection from white. It also has Monstrosity for 5 generic and 2 red, which means that if it isn't monstrous, you can pay that cost and give it 3 +1/+1 counters, and it becomes monstrous. And when it does, it deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. Stormbreath Dragon was great the entire time it was in Standard, one of the most heavily played cards in the format at various times. It did really well in Devotion and Dragon control decks. It was just an amazing finisher, because it could do so much damage so quickly. Abzan was one of the best decks in the format at the time, and having protection from a bunch of their removal and creatures was a big deal. It also has a few odd points in other formats, but has never found consistent success outside of Standard, and that's what led to it not gaining very many points since 2018, and it's lost its spot on the list, despite being so high on it last time. Alright, now that we've looked at the cards from the 2018 list that didn't make it this time, let's move to the list proper, starting with Stonecoil Serpent at number 10, a newcomer to the list that didn't even exist back in 2018 since it was printed in 2019's Throne of Eldraine. For X mana, it's a 0/0 that enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, and it has reach, trample, and protection from multicolored. As an X-costed creature, it can be played anywhere on the curve you want to play it. This means it can be your 2-drop, or you can pump a ton of mana into it and use it as your win condition late too. The card's flexibility and the amount it gives you for your mana has led to it being a multi-format all-star that sees play in all kinds of decks. In Standard, the Snake was largely played in aggro decks. In Pioneer, it's been played in decks like Hardened Scales, which can get some extra value out of the card's +1/+1 counters. And it's also played in Pioneer Blue Red and Soul, which is an artifact-centric deck, and Devotion to Green, which can pump a ton of mana into it to make it massive. In Modern, it's played in Tron decks. In Legacy, it's been played in Affinity over the years, and it also sees a whole lot of play in Vintage, where it fits really well into decks running Mishra's Workshop, since they can make it quite large even in the early game. The Serpent's protection comes up pretty often, especially in Modern Legacy and Vintage, where there are plenty of heavily played multicolored cards. For example, Abrupt Decay is super heavily played in all 3 formats, and is normally a card that would really own an X creature like the Serpent, but it can't even target it. Stonecoil Serpent is going to continue to put up top 8s going forward, and it has a good shot at continuing to move up the list. At number 9, it's Yawgmoth Thran Physician, another newcomer to the list that was printed in 2019, in this case in Modern Horizons. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/4 protection from humans. You can pay 1 life and sacrifice another creature to put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature and draw a card, and you can also pay 2 black and discard a card to proliferate, which means you can choose to put an extra counter on every permanent that has some kind of counter on it. Yawgmoth is inherently powerful. His first activated ability is a free sacrifice effect that can generate cards and remove creatures, and it's also a pretty insane combo enabler. As I mentioned, Yawgmoth is from Modern Horizons, and that means the only paper 60-card formats he's ever been legal in are Modern Legacy and Vintage. It's gained almost all of its points in Modern Toolbox decks that run lots of ways to tutor up creatures, like Court of Calling and Eldritch Evolution. This deck can win in the traditional ways a creature deck can, like just by curving out, but it also has several combo wins. Many of these involve Yawgmoth and creatures with Undying. When a creature with Undying dies, it comes back to the battlefield from the graveyard with a +1/+1 counter on it. If you use Yawgmoth's ability to then put a -1/-1 counter on that creature, the two counters cancel each other out. This means you can just keep sacrificing an Undying creature over and over again to Yawgmoth's ability. You do need to get two Undying creatures in play to pull it off, but with all of those tutors, that really isn't very hard. Throw something like Zulaport Cutthroat into the mix, and you have a combo that drains all of your opponent's life. Yawgmoth's protection actually comes up too. After all, humans are one of the most common creature types in the game, and Modern even has a deck built around them. Yawgmoth is still seeing a ton of play in Modern, and that's not going to change. Like fellow newcomer Stonecoil Serpent, Yawgmoth is probably going to move up the list in the future. At number 8, it's Sword of Feast and Famine, which has dropped 3 slots since 2018. Part of a mega cycle of Swords of X and Y, each of them is a 3-mana equipment that equips for 2, gives the equipped creature +2/+2, protects from 2 colors, and gives 2 effects that trigger when you hit your opponent with that creature. In the case of Feast and Famine, it offers protection from black and green, and when it hits your opponent, they discard a card and you untap all your lands. The protection it offers is a big deal, as it makes it more likely the equipped creature gets in for a hit and gets those triggers, while also making your creature much harder to kill. Protection from black often means that the equipped creature is immune to the best removal spell in a given format. On top of that, this can really disrupt the opponent while also letting you cast more spells. Unsurprisingly, this powerful equipment was heavily played in Standard, usually alongside Stoneforge Mystic, which could tutor it up. This was the most notable in Caw-Blade, one of the most dominant Standard decks of all time. In fact, in every format in which the sword has had success, it's been alongside the powerful Mystic. Being able to run a single copy of the sword that you can always tutor up is quite powerful, and good enough for the sword to find success in Modern and Legacy Mystic decks too. While the sword was fairly active over the last 6 years, it has really slowed down and doesn't have a single major top 8 in 2024. Overall, the entire Swords of X and Y cycle has fallen off in the recent past, as many equipment decks are more about doing completely busted stuff with super expensive equipment that the Mystic can cheat into play, like Cauldron Complete, so Sword of Feast and Famine may not be on the list if I revisit it again in 6 years. At number 7, it's Baneslayer Angel, which has dropped 3 spots since 2018. For 3 generic and 2 white, it's a 5/5 that comes with protection from demons and dragons, and it also has Flying First Strike and Lifelink. Her protection definitely comes up as demons and dragons tend to be pretty pushed, and they often see play. Baneslayer Angel is a frightening creature that is hard to block and hard to attack through, and it gains a ton of life for the player who controls it. That combination is pretty ideal for control decks in multiple formats, as it becomes a card that both helps the control player stabilize and close out the game. Like Sword of Feast and Famine, the Angel was part of the Caw-Blade deck that dominated Standard in 2011, and it didn't see a ton of play after various bannings, like the Mystic, weakened the deck. It's also been played in Modern control deck sideboards. In the time since the last list, the Angel greatly benefited from a Standard legal reprint in Core Set 2021. This not only gave her another run through Standard, which she took advantage of, she also became legal in Pioneer for the first time. That said, she hasn't been nearly as heavily played in either format as she was back in 2011, frequently coming out of the sideboard instead of out of the main deck, so she didn't go completely insane over the last several years either, as evidenced by the fact that she's dropped 3 spots on the list, but she did do enough to remain on the list. At number 6, it's Mother of Runes, which is a newcomer to the list, but it is not a new card. In fact, it was originally printed way back in 1999. She only narrowly missed the list in 2018. She had 28 points then, and it took 35 to make it. But over the last 6 years, she's continued to be very active, and now she easily made the list. For 1 white mana, she's a 1/1, and you can tap her to give target creature protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. That flexibility is incredibly powerful. If you've ever had the misfortune of playing against Mother of Runes, you know it's kind of a nightmare. Your opponent can just leave it untapped and threaten to grant protection to your creature, making your removal pretty bad and making combat into a nightmare. While she saw a little bit of play in Standard and Extended, both of those formats were utterly dominated by insane combo decks at the time, so creature decks that abused the Mother didn't have much room for success. It's Legacy, where the Mother has seen the most play. She's shown up in lots of aggro decks in the format over the years, including Death and Taxes decks these days, which specialize in having really obnoxious disruptive effects on their creatures, and the Mother certainly fits the bill. So the Mother is really only limited to seeing play in the Eternal formats, but that's okay. She sees tons of play in Legacy and is even good enough for Vintage, so she's certainly not done putting up top 8s. At number 5, it's Burrenton Forge Tender, which got dethroned from the number 1 spot it held on the list 6 years ago. The second white card in the list that is really into hating on red decks, the Forge Tender is 1 white for a 1/1 with protection from red, and you can sacrifice it to prevent all damage a red source of your choice would deal this turn. Obviously enough, red decks are all about doing lots of damage, and if you can sacrifice the Forge Tender to blank a burn spell, that alone can sometimes mean game over for them, since red decks' main weakness is that they don't really have a mid to late game, and the Forge Tender makes it pretty likely you get there between blocking red creatures forever and having the ability to stop an entire source of damage. Unsurprisingly, the Forge Tender has been almost exclusively a sideboard card and sees lots of play when red decks are good, especially in Modern, and actually saw a little bit of a renaissance over the last few years as Fury decks started to dominate the format. Unlike a lot of prevention effects, it doesn't just prevent 1 damage to 1 creature or anything, it blanks Fury's entire Enter the Battlefield ability. However, since Fury got banned and red decks got a little less good, the Forge Tender isn't very active right now, so it probably can't fend off all the other cards on this list in the long run. At number 4, it's Emrakul the Promised End, which has moved up 3 spots since 2018. For 13 mana, it's a 13/13, but it costs 1 generic less to cast for each card type among cards in your graveyard. It also comes with flying, trample, and protection from instants, and when it's cast, you gain control of target opponent during that player's next turn, and after that turn, your opponent takes an extra turn after it. Protection from instants definitely comes up, as tons of removal has that type, and it also means your opponent almost certainly cannot kill Emrakul before you take that extra turn for them, and that's important, because if Emrakul is on the board, you can send their best creature into combat and have Emrakul block it. That's part of the beauty of Emrakul in general, because even though your opponent gets another turn after you take one for them, you can completely wreck their entire board in the 1 turn you do control, like by attacking into Emrakul, as I already mentioned, or pointing their removal spells at their own creatures, and so on. It's also not very difficult to decrease the cost of Emrakul so that it's much more manageable. Early on in her time in Standard, Emrakul was played in Emerge and Delirium decks that could cast her, but she got really busted after the introduction of Kaladesh and Aetherworks Marvel. The Marvel made it so that you could get Emrakul into play even earlier, and because Marvel technically lets you cast the card for no mana, you even get the turn-stealing effect. Ultimately, this led to the banning of Emrakul the Promised End in Standard. However, Emrakul has gained a ton of points in all of the other formats, allowing it to stay very active over the years. In Pioneer, it's seen play in Devotion to Green and in Delirium. In Modern, you can find it in decks capable of producing tons of mana like Amulet Titan, Tron, and Omnath. In Legacy, it's played in Cloudpost ramp decks as well as Eldrazi Typal. Emrakul's cast trigger is one of the strongest in the game, and it's also one of the most imposing creatures in the game, so decks in multiple formats are going to continue to be interested in playing Emrakul the Promised End. At number 3, it's True Name Nemesis, a newcomer to the list, but like Mother of Runes, it isn't a new card. It's been around since 2013, but it only had 30 points back in 2018 and didn't make the list, but it's been super active over the last several years, and now it's climbed pretty high on it. For 1 generic and 2 blue mana, it's a 3/1, and when it enters you choose a player, and the Nemesis gains protection from the chosen player. This kind of protection is absolutely insane, since it means that anything your opponent controls can't do anything against True Name Nemesis. That makes it one of the most resilient and evasive creatures in the entire game. In 1v1 games, the Nemesis is effectively unblockable, has hexproof, and prevents all damage dealt to it, which is nuts. It was originally printed in Commander 2013, which means the only 60-card formats it's ever been legal in are Legacy and Vintage, but it's been more than powerful enough for Magic's most powerful formats, and especially Legacy. 3 power and protection for only 3 mana means this thing has done a ton of damage in the Eternal formats, where it can even come down ahead of schedule. It's played in tempo decks in both Legacy and Vintage, sometimes also taking advantage of its creature type by appearing in Merfolk decks, where it gets extra insane. It's going to keep gaining points in the future, and it's not entirely out of the question that it one day moves up at least 1 spot on this list. At number 2, it's the One Ring, a newcomer to the list that was printed in 2023's Tales of Middle-earth. One of the most maligned cards printed in the last couple of years, the One Ring is 4 generic mana for an indestructible legendary artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. So while it's only temporary, giving a player protection from everything for a turn is pretty spicy. Basically, it guarantees you make it to your next turn, and that matters because the One Ring can rapidly take over the game. This is because it gains a burden counter at the beginning of your upkeep and you lose 1 life, and you can tap the ring to draw a card for each burden counter on it. The only 60 card formats that Tales of Middle-earth cards are legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and the One Ring has quickly asserted itself as a staple in all 3 formats. After all, it's colorless and grants insane card advantage to go along with a powerful protection effect. Because it's colorless, it's played in almost every kind of deck in all 3 formats, allowing it to almost come in at number 1 on this list despite being only a little over a year old. Over the last year, the One Ring has been the most heavily played card in Modern, appearing in 50% of all Modern decks. While it's not quite as insane in the Eternal formats, it's still heavily played there, appearing in 21% of all Legacy decks and 15% of all Vintage decks in the same time frame. That level of play is insane, and it's fairly likely that it at least gets banned in Modern at some point, but even if that happens, the One Ring is highly likely to eventually be the number 1 card on the list. For now though, that number 1 card is Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, which has moved up 5 spots since 2018. The original Emrakul, and the second Emrakul on this list, this 15 mana creature comes with the most Eldrazi form of protection ever. It's also a 15/15 that can't be countered, gives you an extra turn when you cast it, comes with flying and Annihilator 6, and whenever it's put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into their library. 15 mana is a lot, but Emrakul delivers the value such a card should. The extra turn means you're going to be able to attack with it before your opponent can ever do anything, and 1 attack from Emrakul is pretty much guaranteed to end the game between smashing in for 15 and making your opponent sacrifice 6 permanents when it attacks. So while Emrakul is occasionally cast by some decks, most of the time people just try to cheat it into play and attack with it a single time, since that's usually all you need. The protection definitely matters there too, since your opponent is very unlikely to stop that attack from happening. You might not get the extra turn, but that's okay. If you put it into play with Goryo's Vengeance, Sneak Attack, Through the Breach, or Nahiri the Harbinger, and only get that 1 attack, the game's still pretty much over. There are decks built around cheating Emrakul into play in multiple formats, and while it's slowed down a little bit since the printing of Atraxa Grand Unifier, another card that's great to cheat into play, Emrakul the Aeon's Torn is by no means done putting up points, but the One Ring is far more heavily played these days, and it's going to overtake it in the future. So, those are the best cards with protection in Magic the Gathering. If you want your creatures to be protected, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at keyword abilities, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.